It is July 7th, 2026, and the Strait of Hormuz is on fire again, less than 24 hours after the President of the United States stood at the White House and told Iran, in plain language, exactly what would happen if this kept up. Early Tuesday, the British military confirmed that 2 commercial vessels were struck by projectiles in the strait, and a separate U.S. official went further, telling CNN that a third, previously unreported strike had also occurred, calling the combined attacks gross violation of the Memorandum of Understanding both countries signed just weeks ago. This is happening at the exact moment Tehran has frozen its own negotiating channel with Washington to bury its supreme leader, at the exact moment Iran's new leader still has not shown his face in public, and at the exact moment Trump had already drawn the clearest line yet on what a next violation would cost. To understand how serious this actually is, you have to understand that this is not an isolated flashpoint. This exact stretch of water has been the single most contested piece of geography in this entire war. Struck, closed, reopened, mined, and fought over more times than almost any other target since the fighting began. Let's go through this piece by piece, because both the sequence of the last 24 hours and the 5 months that led up to it matter for what almost certainly happens next. Start with what actually occurred on the water this morning. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, Britain's maritime security monitor, reported that a tanker travelling off the coast of Oman caught fire after being hit, roughly 8 nautical miles east of the town of Lima, struck on its port side. The attack was first logged just after 9 at night UTC on Monday. Qatar's foreign ministry identified the vessel as the Al Rakiyat, a liquefied natural gas carrier flying the Qatari flag, and said the ship was simply passing near the waterway when it was hit. A second vessel sustained structural damage in a separate strike reported around the same window. No injuries were reported on either ship, and the UKMTO said there were no signs of environmental damage from the fire, though authorities were still investigating. Then came the detail that had not been part of the story a few hours earlier. A U.S. official told CNN that a third vessel had also been struck, a strike that had not previously been reported publicly, bringing the total to 3 commercial ships hit in Omani territorial waters near the strait in a single day. That official did not mince words, describing the combined attacks as a gross violation of the Memorandum of Understanding, and said Washington was considering the full range of options in response. Iranian state television described the attack on the gas tanker without ever directly claiming it as Iran's own action, while Iran's semi-official Fars news agency, citing unnamed sources, reported that the tanker had ignored repeated warnings while trying to use a specific alternate route along the Omani coastline. No official arm of the Iranian government has taken responsibility for any of the 3 strikes as of this writing. Qatar was not waiting for one. The foreign ministry's spokesperson, addressing the strike on a vessel flying his country's flag, called it an unacceptable attack on international navigation, and a serious and explicit violation of international law, and said publicly that Doha holds Iran fully legally responsible for what happened to the Al Rakiyat. That is a significant diplomatic step. Qatar has spent much of this war trying to play mediator between Washington and Tehran, hosting talks, facilitating the Lebanon ceasefire alongside the U.S., and generally positioning itself as one of the few Gulf states Iran still treats as a credible go-between. A direct public statement of legal responsibility aimed at Iran over an attack on a Qatari-flagged ship is Doha effectively confirming that even its own patience has limits. The route the Al Rakiyat was reportedly using when it was hit matters here too. Since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, an alternate corridor hugging the Omani shoreline has become the preferred path for a growing number of vessels trying to avoid Iran's own approved route through the strait, the route Tehran insists ships must use, and, more recently, the route Tehran has floated charging fees to use. Just 2 days before today's attacks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard deployed patrol boats specifically to interdict that Omani route, and Iran's Joint Military Command had already warned days before that every tanker moving through the strait must stick to its approved lanes or face consequences. The message behind today's strikes, then, is not subtle. It is Iran telling every shipping company on Earth that the workaround does not work, and that the price of testing it is a fire on deck in what is technically Omani, not Iranian water. That message landed one day, almost to the hour, after Trump had already told Iran precisely what a violation like this would cost. Speaking at the White House on Monday, before any of today's strikes had happened, he warned that Iran needed to make a deal, in his own words, or we're going to finish the job. He added that he would rather not go that far, because he said he had no interest in hurting the ordinary people of the country. 91 million of them by his count, people he suggested were not responsible for their government's decisions. But he also made clear the scale of what the alternative looked like, saying the United States could knock out Iran's bridges and its energy infrastructure almost as quickly as it chose to. Those were not idle comments from a podium. They were delivered in the same week Washington has repeatedly signaled it is losing patience with the cycle of ceasefire violations along this exact stretch of water. 24 hours later, projectiles were hitting tankers in the strait his own military has spent 5 months trying to keep open. Whether Tehran's security establishment calculated that the warning was empty, whether this attack came from a faction inside the Revolutionary Guard that does not fully answer to whoever is nominally in charge in Tehran right now, or whether it was simply Iran testing exactly how far it could push one more time, the timing puts Trump's own words on the clock in a way he did not choose and cannot walk back. To understand why this waterway keeps becoming the flashpoint, it helps to go back to how this war actually started. In the days before February 28th, American military leadership had explicitly warned Trump that a strike on Iran could prompt Tehran to close the strait entirely. He was told this directly by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and by his own later account, he dismissed the risk, telling his team Iran would likely back down rather than shut down the waterway, and that if it did close the strait, the U.S. military could simply reopen it by force. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated set of strikes across Iran under the name Operation Epic Fury, hitting military facilities, nuclear infrastructure, and senior leadership in a single opening barrage. Among the dead was Ali Khamenei himself, Iran's supreme leader for more than 3 decades, killed along with members of his own family. Iran's answer came fast. Missile barrages aimed at Israeli cities and at American bases across the Gulf, including in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, producing casualties and real infrastructure damage in the first days of the war. The fighting spread almost immediately into Lebanon, where Hezbollah began firing rockets into Israel, and Israel answered with its own strikes. And on March 4th, less than a week into the war, Iran did exactly what it had been warned it might do. It declared the Strait of Hormuz closed and threatened to fire on any vessel that tried to pass through it anyway. What followed was weeks of exactly the pattern playing out again today, just at a larger scale. An Iranian strike hit a U.S.-owned oil tanker early in March, killing an Indian crew member aboard. Days later, a tugboat sent to help another stricken vessel, the Safine Prestige, was struck by 2 missiles and sank outright, leaving crew members missing at sea. The following day, the Revolutionary Guard claimed separate drone strikes on 2 more tankers, one identified as the Prima, hit in the Persian Gulf, and another, a U.S.-linked vessel called the Louis P., hit inside the strait itself. Within days, American intelligence assessed that Iran had begun laying naval mines across shipping lanes in the strait, and Trump publicly demanded their immediate removal. The U.S. military said it went on to destroy 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels in the effort to clear them. Ships continued to be hit through the rest of March and into April. A container vessel struck by fragments, a Kuwaiti-flagged gas tanker hit off Fujairah, another vessel set ablaze off the UAE coast with its crew forced to abandon ship, a Kuwaiti tanker attacked off Dubai, and in early April, Iran fired a cluster missile it claimed had struck an Israel-linked ship. By mid-April, Iran had reclosed the strait a second time, and multiple additional vessels, including one belonging to a French shipping company, were hit in the days that followed, each new incident further complicating the on-again, off-again talks between Washington and Tehran. It was around this period that Trump, in remarks to reporters, first floated the idea of the United States effectively taking control of the waterway himself, and later, in a moment that stuck, began referring to it publicly as the Strait of Trump. The pattern did not stop there. Into May, an attack on a container ship prompted Trump to suspend a newly proposed transit corridor through the strait entirely. Iran seized an oil tanker in the Gulf of Oman days later, and an Indian-flagged cargo ship sank after a drone strike near Oman soon after that, a loss India's government publicly called deplorable. Another vessel was seized off Fujairah and steered toward Iranian waters under what monitors described as forced escort. Regional disruption spread well beyond shipping during these weeks, too. In early May, Iran launched a wave of drone and rocket attacks at the UAE, prompting Emirati air defenses to intercept 19 incoming projectiles in a single day. 3 Indian nationals working at an oil facility in Fujairah were injured when a strike sparked a major fire there, and UAE schools shifted to remote learning for the rest of that week purely out of caution. A South Korean-operated vessel caught fire after an explosion in the strait around the same time, one of dozens of South Korea-linked ships that had been effectively stranded near the waterway since the war began. By June, a container ship operated by a major shipping line was struck, and an attack on another container ship led the International Maritime Organization to halt its own coordination of the alternate shipping route it had been trying to establish. Only in the final days of June did shipping analysts start describing the strait as moving from outright shutdown toward what one report called managed recovery, a fragile, cautious return of traffic that depended entirely on the ceasefire holding. That fragile recovery is what the Memorandum of Understanding signed on June 17th between Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian was supposed to lock in. The deal was meant to end the war outright and reopen the strait for good, guaranteeing free passage for commercial vessels for a 60-day window with no Iranian fees attached. 2 days later, Trump announced a parallel ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, brokered with help from Qatar and Iran itself. It did not hold cleanly. Israel continued striking targets in southern Lebanon in the days that followed. And on June 20th, Iran announced it was closing the strait yet again, citing those continued Israeli strikes as a violation of the broader agreement, a claim the U.S. military flatly denied. By June 27th, the Joint Maritime Information Center, overseen by the U.S. Navy, announced it had widened an alternate route through the strait near Oman, opening it to more traffic in both directions, a direct challenge to Iran's insistence on controlling who passes and how. That is the exact corridor Iranian patrol boats were sent to block just days ago, and the exact corridor a Qatari tanker was reportedly using when it was hit early this morning. It was only days after that widened route was announced that the most recent full replay of this entire cycle happened, the one worth remembering right now because it is close to a preview of what may be coming in the next day or two. A cargo ship was struck while exiting the strait along the Omani coast. Within a day, U.S. Central Command launched retaliatory strikes against Iran, with the Pentagon stating publicly that the strikes came in direct response to Iran's aggression against commercial shipping, and noting that Iran had been given a chance to honor the ceasefire and chose not to take it. Iran answered the following day, saying it had hit targets linked to what it called American aggressor forces in the region, and criticizing Gulf states for allowing their territory to be used against it. That same evening, Central Command launched a second and larger wave of strikes at Trump's direct order. The Revolutionary Guard, for its part, put out a statement promising it would deal with vessels violating its approved routes stronger than before. Every element of that exact sequence, a tanker hit, a U.S. warning, a retaliatory strike, an Iranian counterstrike framed as defensive, another wave of American strikes, is the template this morning's attacks now sit on top of. The only real variable left is how fast and how large the next link in that chain turns out to be. Layered on top of all of that is a complication the earlier rounds of this cycle did not have to deal with. Tehran has formally paused its negotiations with Washington for the multi-day funeral of Ali Khamenei, whose remains were flown this week to the seminary city of Qom for further mourning after days of ceremonies in Tehran. Iranian state television aired live footage of hundreds of thousands of mourners walking toward Jamkran Mosque, just outside the city, to pay their respects. Some of those same mourners have openly called for Trump's death at the processions. And the man, who now formally holds the title of Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has still not appeared in person at a single one of the ceremonies held in his own father's honor, leaving the country's actual chain of command exactly as unclear as it was the week before. At precisely the moment a fast, coherent decision from Tehran is what the situation calls for. There is, in practical terms, no functioning diplomatic channel open right now to walk this back through, and no single obviously empowered figure on the Iranian side for Washington to even be negotiating with, if one opened tomorrow. The economic stakes sitting underneath all of this have not gone anywhere either. In peacetime, close to a fifth of the world's traded oil and natural gas passed through this 34-kilometer-wide channel between Iran and Oman. War risk insurance premiums for tankers transiting the strait, which sat around 1/8% of a ship's insured value before the war, climbed as high as 0.4% in the run-up to the fighting, adding something like $250,000 in extra cost for a single pass by one of the largest crude carriers. Shipping data from the tracking firm Kepler showed more than 100 vessels crossed through the strait using various routes just last weekend, a genuinely fragile sign that global trade was cautiously testing whether the ceasefire would hold long enough to resume something like normal traffic. China, which relies heavily on energy shipped through this exact corridor, has publicly pushed for the strait to reopen fully, a pressure point that has repeatedly complicated Trump's own broader diplomacy with Beijing, including an anticipated visit that Washington had already delayed once earlier in the war, specifically because of the fighting. Every one of the attacks recounted here, from the tanker sunk while under tow in March to the Al Raqiat this morning, chips away at the same fragile confidence that keeps that traffic moving, and every side involved keeps threatening to make the underlying standoff far worse if the other does not back down first. It is also worth being clear that this has never been purely a U.S.-Iran story playing out in isolation. The ships hit across these 5 months have flown flags from Singapore, Qatar, Kuwait, South Korea, France, and beyond, carrying crews and cargo with no direct stake in the dispute over who controls a shipping lane. Indian nationals have been killed and injured in these attacks more than once. South Korean-linked vessels sat stranded near the strait for months at a time. Regional schools in the UAE shut their doors and went remote out of pure caution during periods of heaviest fire. That breadth is part of why today's strikes are already drawing sharp public statements from governments like Qatar's that have mostly tried to stay above the fray as neutral mediators up to this point. When a mediator starts publicly assigning legal responsibility, it is usually a signal that quiet diplomacy has stopped working. So what happens from here? As of this moment, American officials say a response is being weighed, not yet decided, and that every option remains on the table. Given how quickly this precise sequence has moved every previous time it has played out, Ship struck on a Thursday, U.S. strikes by Friday, Iranian retaliation the next day, a second and larger wave of American strikes that same evening. There is little reason to expect a long pause this time either. Trump's own words from barely a day before this morning's attacks make a muted response politically difficult for him to choose, even if he wanted to. At the same time, the fractured state of Iran's own leadership right now cuts in an unpredictable direction. A more unified Tehran, in earlier rounds of this war, still managed to answer American strikes within roughly a day. Whether a Revolutionary Guard leadership currently absorbed in burying its own supreme leader, managing an unresolved succession crisis, and reportedly isolating its own titular leader behind a security cordon, can coordinate an equally fast and equally coherent answer this time, is genuinely unclear, and that uncertainty cuts both ways. It could mean a slower, more restrained Iranian response than usual. It could just as easily mean a response driven by whichever individual commander gets there first, with no clear chain of command left to rein it in afterward. That is where this stands right now. Iran struck at least 2, and by American accounts 3, commercial vessels in or near the Strait of Hormuz in a single morning. Qatar is holding Tehran legally responsible for one of them, a rare public break from its usual role as quiet mediator. The attack landed almost exactly 24 hours after Trump personally promised, from the White House podium, to finish the job if this happened again. It landed while Iran's own negotiating track with Washington sits frozen for a funeral, while hundreds of thousands of mourners process toward a mosque outside Qom, calling for the American president's death, and while the man, now formally titled Supreme Leader, has yet to say a single public word since taking the position. Behind it all sits 5 months of the exact same story, repeating itself along the exact same stretch of water. A tanker hit, a warning issued, a strike answered, a ceasefire patched back together just long enough to break again. Washington says a response is being weighed. History from the last 5 months says that response rarely takes long once the decision gets made. Whether American aircraft are already back in the skies over Iran by the time this reaches you, or whether this is the one time the cycle breaks down entirely, with no single Iranian voice left able to answer for what happens next, is the question the coming hours are about to settle one way or another.